Turn your Bibles to Ezra chapter 3. Ezra chapter 3. Last week we began our study of post-exilic Israel. So Israel after its return from the exile. And we started in Ezra chapter 1. And we were able to cover 2 chapters, since that second chapter is mostly just names. We looked at some of the surprising characteristics of post-exilic Israel, which makes it rather relevant to the church today. The exile, the return, the need for a renewing of leadership could be compared to the exile that we sort of felt with the pandemic and the return and the need to freshen things up a little bit. So as we go through this study, we're going to be looking at not just how this applies to us as individuals, but how would God want this to apply to the church as a body? Because that's what the Bible is for. It's for us as an individual, but it's also for us as a church body. So as we go through this study, let's be looking at what does God want for us as individuals and with us as a church. And with this mindset, we looked at the historical events which led up to the exile and the return. We see that God had created the nation of Israel to be an example to the surrounding nations in the way it was governed, in the way that they lived, the way they handled different situations. They were different, they were unique, they were a peculiar people. They were supposed to draw attention to themselves and then point that attention to God. And it was supposed to draw in the nations. And we saw a little, Israel realized a little bit of this purpose under King David, where King David was attracting to himself and to the nation Hittites and other groups of people who joined themselves to David because they liked what they saw. They loved the nation of Israel, and they began to worship the same God that David worshipped. But the rest of the history of Israel has just been them struggling with being peculiar. They didn't like to be peculiar. They didn't like to stand out and be different than the nations around them. It got to the point where they were struggling to be a distinct people, to the point where God removed them as a nation because they could no longer fulfill their purpose. And so after 70 years of captivity, God finally restores the Jews back to their land for the purpose of rebuilding the temple and reinstituting the worship of God. And God, he brought this about by stirring the heart of King Cyrus. King Cyrus restores the articles of the temple, funds the return, gets everybody moving in that direction, and God stirs the hearts of certain Jews to go on the return. And somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people return to Israel, which is a small percentage of what would have gone into captivity and the numbers that they would have multiplied to become in the captivity. But they were people that God had specifically touched the heart of because they were the right people for the job. And so they returned to Israel. they come back for the purpose of rebuilding the temple, and we learned from this that regardless of what happens, no matter the uncertainty that we might feel, God will continue his ministry. It seemed that Israel was done as a nation. Their nationhood was wiped out. Their city was destroyed. The temple was gone. All the articles of worship were in some Babylonian warehouse. And the people, all the intelligentsia of the nation was taken into captivity, and it seemed that it would be impossible to restore things to the way they were before, the way they were supposed to be. But we see that God is sovereign, God is in control, and God can bring about the restoration of his worship. God will not let the activities of some domineering human being to to prevent what he wants to happen. And so God will continue the work that he begins, and he will raise up the right people to do it. And we saw that God touched the hearts of nearly 50,000 Jews to return to the land and rebuild the temple. What sort of people were they? What sort of people does God use to restore and continue his work? Today we will see that the people who returned to the promised land were quite varied in their type, but they all had three essential behaviors needed to restore God's ministry. So let's read our passage, Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 13, which is And when the 7th month was come, and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered themselves together as one man to Jerusalem. Then stood up Jeshua, son of Josedek, and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and his brethren, and builded the altar of God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings thereon, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. And they set the altar upon his base, for fear was upon them because of the people of those countries, and they offered burnt offerings thereon unto the Lord, even burnt offerings morning and evening. They kept also the feast of the tabernacles, as it is written, and offered the daily burnt offering by number, according to the custom, as the duty of every day required. And afterward offered the continual burnt offering, both of the new moons and of all the set feasts of the Lord that were consecrated, and every one that willingly offered a free will offering unto the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month began they to offer burnt offerings unto the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. They gave money also unto the masons and to the carpenters, and meat and drink and oil unto them of Zidon and to them of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea of Joppa, according to the grant that they had of Cyrus king of Persia. Now in the 2nd year of their coming unto the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month began Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua son of Josedek, and the remnant of their brethren, the priests and the Levites, and all they that were come out of the captivity unto Jerusalem, and appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward, and set forward the work of the house of the Lord. Then stood Jeshua with his sons and his brethren, Kadmiel and his sons, the sons of Judah, together, to set forward the workmen in the house of God, the sons of Henadad, with their sons and their brethren, the Levites. And when the builders laid the foundations of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together by course in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he was good, for his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, that had seen the first house when the foundations of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard far off. The Jews who came back from the exile were about as various as they were many. Some were peasants, some were leaders, some were of one tribe, some came from other tribes, some were priests, some were Levites. Some could trace their ancestry back to service under Solomon, while others couldn't verify their ancestry at all. But as we can see from our passage, all these people had the same mindset in common, and their unified behavior enabled them to accomplish great things for the Lord together. Let's look at 3 of these behaviors that they displayed. First, they had proper priorities. The returnees started out right because they had their priorities straight. Upon their return, the Jews immediately started on reestablishing the worship of God. These followers of God had their priorities straight. They came back for a purpose. They came back to rebuild the temple. So after they got back and they settled into their cities and they were, they had unpacked their belongings, immediately they all joined up together in Jerusalem and started rebuilding the altar so they could offer sacrifices to God again. Because the returnees had their priorities straight, they didn't get distracted with the sideshow of reoccupying the land. They had their priorities straight. They get back home, they get things settled in, and immediately they start rebuilding the altar. And they go through and they start observing all of the sacrifices, the morning and the evening, and the continual, and the free will offerings, and as soon as they can, they reinstitute the worship of God. It would have been easy for the Jews, though, to have gotten focused on rebuilding their homes, establishing their farms, tending the soil which had lain fallow for 70 years, clearing brush and tilling the land and planting their seeds. They could easily have gotten distracted with all of that if they hadn't had the right motives for being there, if they didn't have their priorities straight. Have you ever seen a disruptive child at a wedding? They squirm in their seats and they make noise and embarrass their parents, and they run around and get into trouble, and they try to get the piece of cake first, and why are they so disrespectful and self-centered on this special happy occasion? It's because they're not there for the right reasons. They're there because their parents made them go there. They're there because there's cake. They're there because their buddies are going to be there. They're not there to wish the happy couple a great future. They don't really care. Those are just old folks. They don't have anything to do with that. They're just there for what they can get out of it. They are not there for the right motives. When you don't have the right motives for participating in something, you're likely going to allow the non-essentials to become your priorities. You're going to let the cake become the most important thing about a wedding, as opposed to the union of two young people. And similarly, if these folks didn't have the right motives for coming back to the land, if they weren't motivated by the desire to reestablish the worship of God, then it would have been very easy for them to get distracted by the blessing of being back in the land. Wow, I'm finally home after 70 years. Oh, this is the land that my fathers all told me about. Oh, wow, a lot of work needs to be done. Better fix the house, better till the soil. Got to get some crops in the ground, or we're not going to have anything to eat. Got to clear the brush because nobody's been doing that for 70 years. It would have been very easy to get distracted by the things that they would have wanted to do, that they would have found to be the most important, if they didn't have the right motives, if they didn't have the right desires, if they didn't make reestablishing the worship of God the main priority. So but they had their priorities straight. They returned for the right reasons. They had the right motives, and that helped them keep their priorities straight in the face of tempting distractions. And this was an essential behavior. Otherwise, the temple would not have been rebuilt. Otherwise, the worship of God would not have been reestablished. And God, when He touched the hearts of a couple thousand people to return to the land, He touched the hearts of people who would have the right focus, who would put the right priorities first, who would not be distracted by the blessings of being in the land, but would have the right motives for being there. The Jews, they not only had their priorities straight, but they also had a proper sense of urgency. They had a sense of urgency. These followers of God understood that they didn't have time to waste. They did not have time to waste. They didn't dawdle around once they got back in the land. It wasn't long after getting there and getting settled that they gathered themselves together and started setting a plan. All right, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to rebuild the temple. We're going to start with the altar. We're going to start with getting those sacrifices going again. The worship of God was supposed to be continuous. The fire of the altar was never supposed to go out. Leviticus 6:13 says, "The fire shall ever be burning upon the altar; it shall never go out." But the fire had been out for 70 years, because for 70 years there hasn't been an altar. And the people didn't say, well, it's been out 70 years, another year won't hurt. Let's just get some crops in the ground and get things started first. Let's take our time and get ourselves established first before we start on this big project. No, they rebuilt the altar and reestablished the sacrifices as soon as it was possible to do so. They had a sense of urgency. They understood that this is why we're here and we need to get this done. The returnees, they didn't rush themselves. They didn't delay the purpose either. They didn't all right, let's get this done so we can get on to the next thing. They did it right. They built the altar and they practiced all of the sacrifices and they did things as it was written. But they also didn't delay their purpose. They didn't put it off. They didn't say, well, let's get other things done first. They understood the significance of what they were doing and their need to do it in a timely manner. They also were not unaware that what they were doing would not be looked on favorably by the surrounding nations. It says they were afraid. The Jews' work, while it may have had the approval of Cyrus the king lived far away. The king was not nearby. The king was probably a couple hundred miles, maybe a couple thousand miles away. The king was not right there. And the Jews had never been popular with their neighbors. Edom, Moab, the Syrians, the Ammonites, the new group, Samaritans, all disliked Israel and didn't want to see Jerusalem restored to any prominence in any sort of way. Jerusalem was destroyed. It was a wasteland. There was a handful of people who were living there in a couple of burnt-out huts. That's pretty much what Jerusalem was. It had lost all of its significance. But if Jerusalem were rebuilt and became a big city again, the surrounding nations would be the ones who would suffer economically, because it would be a draw. Not to mention they just didn't like the Jews to begin with. So, they did not want to see the temple rebuilt. And we'll see that next week. But the Jews, they couldn't take for granted that they would have all the time they want to accomplish the task they had been given. If anything, the captivity should have taught them not to presume upon God's timetable as their fathers had. Sometimes we get the idea that we've got time. We've got time. We'll just take this slow. We'll do it as is convenient. And no need to be rushed about anything. Uh, but the fact of the matter is, time is not really on our side. Every day the world gets worse. Every day things could change suddenly. We can't even guarantee our own lifespan. What makes us think that we have the time, all the time that we think we need? The Jews, they understood they couldn't take it for granted that they would have all the time they could want to accomplish the task they had been given. And they had a proper sense of urgency. They understood, we're here for a purpose, we have a mission, and we need to get this done. So they had their priorities straight when they got back to their land. Their right motives kept them from getting distracted. They had a sense of urgency, which compelled them to get to work immediately. But finally, the Jews were dedicated to their work. They were dedicated to their work. The people had a focus. Everybody was on board with the project. Historically, every time the Jews tried to do the right thing, there were always detractors, people who didn't want to participate, people who were resisting the will of God. Under Moses, there were those who grumbled at his authority. Think of Korah, who led a rebellion, which ultimately they were all swallowed up by the earth. But Moses, who all Jews ever since then have looked back as, he's the guy. Aside from Abraham, it's Moses, right? But even Moses, he had his detractors. Under the judges, there was constant dissent. Few of the kings were ever able to remove the worship of the false gods completely. There was always resistance. There was always detractors. There was always some holdout who didn't want to participate, who didn't want the will of God to be accomplished. And later on, under Nehemiah, they'll suffer similar problems of disunity. But right now, everybody who's there wants to be there. Everybody who's there is on board with the project. Everybody who's there is in agreement. This is why we're here. This is what we're here to do. This is what we're going to do. This is why we traveled over 1,000 miles and left our homes to come to do, and we're going to do it. And they had unity. They had focus. And they were dedicated to their work. And they looked after the details. The returnees were not sloppy. They were not careless with reestablishing the worship of God. Rather, they diligently studied the scriptures to make sure that they were doing everything right. Throughout our passage, it says they did what they were doing as it was written. They rebuilt the altar in its proper place as it was written. They offered the different sacrifices as it had been written by Moses. They celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacles according to its description as it had been written in the book of Numbers. These Jews, they had left their homes, traveled hundreds of miles, and had committed themselves and their resources to this venture, and they were not going to do a sloppy job of it. And they didn't delay their purpose. They got right to it, but they also took the time it needed to do it right, to study it out, to make sure that they had the right plan in what they were doing. They took 2 years to lay the foundation. Later on when they rebuild the rest of the temple, it takes them less than a year. but they needed that time to refresh themselves, to retrain the priesthood who hadn't been active for 70 years, to know how to properly administer those sacrifices, to know where the dimensions of the temple needed to be laid, to lay all the stones. It took them 2 years before they could sort everything out properly, but they gave it the same level of diligence. They kept their sense of urgency. They made it their priority. That was their purpose. How many times do we start a task with great dedication and focus and attention to detail, and the end is embarrassingly less impressive than when we start? Megley and I are listening to an audiobook. We're listening to the Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King. And there's one part where Gimli the dwarf and Legolas the elf are looking at the fortress of Minas Tirith. And Gimli the dwarf says, "Doubtless the good stonework is older and was wrought in the first building," said Gimli. "It is ever so with the things of men. They begin, there's a frost in spring or a blight in summer, and they fail of their promise." They start out really well. It's human nature. We start out really well. We got all this attention to detail. We've got all this focus. We're dedicated, and things get a little bit, times gets a little bit crunched. Well, this is dragging out a little bit longer than we thought it would. Let's hurry and at the end of the project, you can clearly see where you started, because that's got all the attention to detail and is done immaculately and perfect, and then everything else is just a little bit sloppy to go up. But these Jews, they had the right focus. They had the attention to detail they needed. They had the dedication to their work. From the outset of their return to the laying of the foundations of the temple, the returnees were committed totally to accomplishing their task. God had stirred the hearts of a unique set of people to restore his ministry. And God restored these unique people back to their land, and they immediately began to restore the worship of their God, and their unifying spirit was committed to the proper priorities with a healthy sense of urgency and a high level of dedication. Despite the differences in their social class and in their upbringing, and probably some of their own traditions and their functions in the nation, they were able to be united around this purpose. This is what we're doing. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to be focused. We're going to be dedicated. We're not going to get distracted. We're going to have the right sense of urgency. We're going to get this done. And as we consider this lesson for ourselves and for the church, we need to be asking ourselves some questions. For us personally, do I have for me personally, for you personally, do I have my priorities straight? Am I willing to take, or am I willing to take care of, wanting to take care of myself before I take care of the things of God? They had the right priorities. Do we have the right priorities? In our individual lives, do we have the right priorities? Do we put the things of God first, or do we put our own interests first? And for the church, does our church have its priorities straight? That might sound strange. Of course we've got our priorities straight. We're church. What else would we be here for other than to serve God and to worship him? But do we put God's interests before the people's interests? Do God's commands take precedence over our traditions? Do we know why we exist as a church? What's our purpose? Or are we mindlessly doing the things that we've always done? A church can lose its focus. A church can lose its priorities. A church can get focused on fellowship and forget that we have a great commission. A church can get focused on, well, what do the people want? What will make everybody happy and content and draw people in here, without realizing to what purpose do we do this? We can forget why we're here as a church. How many of you can tell me what is the purpose for a church? Do you have a definition in your mind of what the purpose for a church is? That's a question that we need to answer as a church. But the Jews, they had their priorities straight. They knew why they were there, and they had a good sense of urgency. Do I have a healthy sense of urgency? Or do I rush through the things that God has for me to do? Or worse, do I put them off to another day, presuming I'll have the time to do them later? Do I realize that there's an enemy out there who would devour me like a lion if I am not prepared to defend myself against his attacks? Do we have the proper sense of urgency in living our Christian lives? These Jews, they had the proper sense of urgency. They knew why they were there. They had their focus. They had their priorities straight. They were there for a purpose. They were going to get it done. They knew they didn't have all the time in the world to do it, and they knew that somebody might kill them if they didn't do it. But do we really go through our own lives with that sense of urgency? I can do my devotion for them. Put it on. Or, all right, fine. I'll read through this chapter as fast as I can, just so I can get it done. Both of those are the wrong ways to approach doing the Christian walk. But we do. We put things off, or we rush through it just to get it done so we can move on to our things. We don't have the right sense of urgency. We don't have the proper sense of urgency that tells us, all right, I need to get this done, but I need to dedicate to it the right amount of time to get it done the right way. Does the church have a proper sense of urgency in its ministry, or do we float along while opportunities pass us by? Oh, this is an opportunity for the church to meet a need over here. Well, that's going to take a lot of organization. We're going to have to make flyers, and we're going to have to tell people and do something. And you know what? There's another church down the road that I think they're a little bit closer in location, and I know they've got some really great people who love doing things like that. How about you go over there? Do we have a proper sense of urgency, or do we put things off? You know what? We really should get an evangelistic ministry going, or an old folks ministry going, or a youth ministry going. But we're going to wait for the right time, the right person. We're not going to. Now's not the right moment. Or do we just hop haphazardly into it? All right, let's do this, and not give it the right planning, and then it collapses into a disaster. And yeah, I knew that wasn't a good idea to begin with. Do we have the right sense of urgency in how we conduct our ministry? The Jews, they had a right sense of urgency, and they also had the right level of dedication. Do I serve the Lord with a high level of dedication, or do I simply do what I must to get by? Am I focused? Do I pay attention to the details? Will I stick with it when living the Christian life gets tough, or will I fade out? Will I start strong, detailed, focused, and wow, this keeps going on. Wow, this isn't so easy as I thought, and we get sloppy, and just like a lot of criticism that we deserve in other places. We start well, but we end sloppy. Do we pay attention to the details? Do we really care? Are we really focused? Will we really stick with it? Or will we fade out? What is our level of dedication? And does the church have a high level of dedication in carrying out the Lord's commands? Are we focused? Are we attentive to the details of ministry? Do we stick with it when ministry gets tough? Or are we like, well, that didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. The VBS didn't have the turnout that I feel we needed to make it worthwhile. So let's just not do that again. Or I'm not going to participate with that again. Or, you name it. Are we dedicated enough to carry out the commands of the Lord? Are we focused? Are we attentive to detail in ministry as a church? Do we stick with it when it gets tough? Or do we fade out? When we step out of our comfort zone, when things don't turn out the way we wanted it to or envisioned it, do we fade out, or do we stick with it? These are questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we consider what it takes to renew God's ministry in our own lives and in the church. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness to us, and thank you for the example of returning Israel and the dedication that they had, the focus, the sense of urgency, their priorities and right motives. Father, help us to have right motives and right priorities, and to follow their good example in our own lives and in our church's ministry. Help us to renew the ministry of our own lives and the church in a way that honors you, that glorifies you. For truly, Lord, we always need a good renewing. In Jesus' name.